So, we've got this really interesting case today. It's about a single company, but they're responsible for two totally different pollution incidents. And believe me, the legal journey that follows is a real roller coaster, full of twists and turns that you probably won't see coming. It stretched on for almost 4 years. All right, let's just take a look at the timeline here. This really shows you what a long, winding road this was. We're talking about a case that went through the entire court system, from the very first incident all the way to this wild twist at the end. Almost 4 years. Okay, so first things first, before we can even get into the legal drama, we really need to understand what happened. What were these two pollution events that kicked this whole thing off? And this part is so important. We're talking about two completely different situations. The first one, it was an accident, right? An old corroded pipe just gives out, it leaks chemicals into a creek. Bad, for sure, but an accident. But then, not even a year later, you have the second incident. This was no accident. This was 3 separate times where they deliberately dumped untreated waste. And get this, it was into a creek that actually feeds a public water supply. So you see the difference? One was negligence. The other was 100% intentional. Wow. I mean, the numbers here are just staggering. Look at these chromium levels. The intentional dumping? Yeah, that was bad. More than 20 times the legal limit. But the accidental leak? That's the real shocker. We're talking over 600 times the legal standard. It's just off the charts. Both of these were, without a doubt, massive environmental disasters. So how did the courts deal with this? Let's start at the beginning, with the district court. Well, the court found the company's rep, a guy named Mr. Chin, guilty on both counts. And when they looked at both crimes together, they decided to combine the penalties into one single sentence: 2 years in prison. And it wasn't just him, you know? The company itself, Sonday Precision Technology, also got hit with a pretty hefty fine. We're talking 4 million new Taiwan dollars. But there was a catch. The court added this one little condition that basically changed everything, at least for the time being. They suspended both sentences for 5 years. So what does that mean? It's kind of like the judges saying, look, we're putting these penalties on hold. If you can stay out of trouble for 5 years and follow all the rules, then you won't have to go to prison, and the company won't have to pay that big fine. It's like a probation period with a huge penalty hanging over your head. But the story doesn't end there, not by a long shot. The prosecutor was not happy with that suspended sentence. They thought it was way too lenient, and their decision to appeal, well, that's where the story really takes a turn. And the prosecutor's argument was pretty straightforward and honestly pretty powerful. They basically said, wait a minute, this guy had an accident, and then less than a year later, he goes and does something even worse, and this time on purpose. To them, giving a suspended sentence just sent the completely wrong message. It didn't feel like justice. And guess what? The High Court agreed with the prosecutor. They revoked the suspended sentence. Just like that, the game completely changed. That 2-year prison sentence wasn't some far-off possibility anymore. It was real, and it was happening. So now, with actual prison time staring him in the face, the defendant wasn't about to give up. He decided to fight this thing with everything he had, using every legal option available. And he took it all the way to the top, to the Supreme Court. But here's the thing. The Supreme Court looked at the High Court's decision and said, nope, we don't see any legal mistakes here. They dismissed his appeal, and that made it official. The 2-year prison sentence was final, sealed. So at this point, you'd think it's over, right? He's gone through all the appeals, the highest court has spoken, Mr. Chen is heading to prison for 2 years. Case closed. Or was it? Just when you think the book is closed on this case, the defendant pulls out one last final legal move, a request for a retrial. And this is where we get that final, absolutely stunning twist. So what does that even mean? He filed for something called an extraordinary appeal, basically asking for a do-over. And his reason? He claimed they found new evidence. Evidence that, for whatever reason, was never brought up in any of the original trials. So what was this so-called new evidence? Well, it was a whole stack of maintenance records, invoices, checklists dating back years. And his whole argument was built around this. He's saying, look at all these documents. They prove I hired professionals to maintain the equipment that caused that first accidental leak. How can you say I was negligent when I was literally paying experts to make sure this didn't happen? And this is where it gets really fascinating.
The court's decision was brilliant, actually. They didn't just give a simple yes or no. They split their verdict with surgical precision. For that first incident, the accidental leak, they said, okay, you get a retrial. Why? Because those maintenance records are directly related to that event. It creates a reasonable doubt about whether he was actually negligent. But for the second incident, the intentional dumping, the court said absolutely not. And their logic was perfect. Having maintenance records doesn't matter one bit when your crime was deliberately turning off the safety systems to dump waste illegally. The evidence was completely irrelevant to that crime. So let's just break down where that leaves us. It's a bit complicated. The defendant now gets a do-over, a whole new trial, for that first charge of negligence. But the conviction for the much more serious crime, the intentional dumping, that still stands. And he still has to serve the time for that. 1 year and 8 months in prison. No getting out of that one.
You know, a case like this is just such a powerful reminder of how the legal system works. We think of a verdict as being, well, final. But this shows that even when everything seems settled, there are these built-in ways for the system to correct itself, to adapt when new information comes to light. It really proves that justice isn't always a single black and white moment. It's a process, a constant search for the truth, even long after you think the story is over.